This episode is presented by Invest Puerto Rico. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place.
Hello and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. I'm Max Zeff, and today we're zeroing in on DeepSeek, the Chinese AI lab that's been going absolutely viral this week. To talk about it all, I'm joined by Jan Stoica, a professor of computer science at UC Berkeley, and also the co-founder and executive chairman of Databricks, as well as Anyscale. He's very active in the AI policy world, and he's perfect to break all this down for us. Jan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Max.
Of course. So I think right off the bat, I would love to kind of just quickly separate, facts from hype here. And could you kind of break down for us what to you are the real breakthroughs that DeepSeek has achieved with its recent models and what is overhyped and has gotten too much play?
Yeah, so I think I will start with three things which are pretty factual. So first, obviously, is performing very well on the benchmarks. Not only that, but also on our own chatbot arena, which, as you probably know, it's a very popular in the wild large language model evaluation platform. And where it's now in number 3, at least the last time I checked. So clearly it matches or provide roughly similar performance as the top large language models, proprietary models. The number 2, what we know because the model is released, we know that serving queries on DeepSeek R1 and V3 is very efficient. And obviously the number 3, it's open source. So I think that's what definitely in my mind, behind the hype, it's changing a little bit the trajectory of evolution of these models in the sense that it's accelerated. Now, in terms of fundamentally, DeepSeek is not a new architecture. Of course, it's the same transformer and things like that. Also, most of the techniques they are using are not necessarily new. However, what they are doing is that, and they are doing a superb job of taking these techniques and really pushing them and making them work very well together. Many of these techniques are published in research papers, but they are more brittle and things like that. And then you get this compounding effect because you are going to get, say, 50% efficient from this technique, 50% from this technique, 50% from these techniques. And when you are going to multiply all of those together, you are going to get an order of magnitude or more. Like to give an example, everyone knows it's a mixture of experts model. You have multiple experts. So the key here is and that's why it's more efficient, right? Because when you train or query the model, it's only a fraction of neurons are activated. Now, this is well known from GPT-4. It's also a mixture of experts. But in general, it's the ratio of number of the neurons which are active versus the total number of your neurons. Typically, it's between 25% or maybe in the best case scenario, 12.5%. And the reason is that the lower the fraction, the learning is less stable. But DeepSeek is 5.5%. Another example, they used 8 bits when they are training instead of 16 bits. They optimize communication and a few other things. I'm going to stop here, but you get the idea.
Right. So you touched on a lot of the kind of efficiency gains that they were capable of achieving. But I'm curious kind of how you think that this plays out for chip makers here. I mean, you work with lots of chip companies, and there was some concern that these efficiency gains mean that we don't need these enormous clusters anymore. Can you kind of break down that argument?
I think that's a good question. I am in the camp which believes that, on the contrary, the lower cost will spur the demand in terms of, you are going to accelerate the growth and the adoption of the AI for those enterprises. And that growth in volume is going to offset the reduction in the cost. And in fact, I am always wondering because why people say that or take that for granted, because we already have some data about it. And the data I'm referring to is, just think about OpenAI. The cost of serving the request, the prompts, decreased by a factor of what? Almost 100 in 2 years. And what happened with the revenue is OpenAI, just exploded. Obviously, the reason they are able to provide lower cost because they have much more efficient models. So, this always happens. But I think that at the beginning of an industry, if you reduce the cost, then you just spur the demand. It's very different from an industry which is mature and it's already penetrated. The new technology penetrated, so to speak, all the industries or the industries which is a good fit for. And now you reduce the cost, right? Because then the volume is not going to increase as much because already everyone who should use that technology is using it. But with AI, it's very different.
Right. And I'm curious if you could kind of help me break down how this really changes the AI landscape in Silicon Valley, because I think that there's a lot of implications here. One I want to start with when we're talking about this is the kind of battle, the push and pull between open source and closed source. I mean, this is an open model. And what do you kind of make of this open model being so competitive?
This is a subject dear to my heart. Thank you for asking. And just to provide a context, I've been involved in open source projects for quite a bit at Berkeley, and Berkeley itself has been the cradle of the open source all the way from the Unix BSD and the first database systems like Ingress or open source and many others. And the project I've been talking about, I've been involved in, were like Apache Spark, which was started Databricks. It's based on that project, or any scale you mentioned is based on another project. Ray, open source to scale machine learning workloads. So I'm really a believer in open source. And I think that from my perspective and why open source, obviously the advantage of the open source is that it accelerates the progress because you have a common artifact. Everyone can work on it, share it, and improve it. So the speed of iteration and progress can accelerate. And I think that unfortunately what happened in the US last year is that, and for the past 2 years or so, 3 years, the development and the research and the progress in this large language model space came in kind of silos, right? You have Anthropic, you have OpenAI, you have Google. Now you have XAI, with one notable exception, which is Meta, right? And then the academia is not really part of the game because the lack of resources, right? So you have this kind of very insular approach. And obviously, from the point of view of maximizing the progress, it's not optimal. Because if you want to optimize the progress, you want to have all these people, your best people working on the problem. So I do think that this is a failure of not realizing that and encouraging or even discouraging the open source. Because if you remember, it was a lot of discussion last year about why we shouldn't build powerful open source model in the US, right? And there are a lot of regulatory frameworks which are pushed through the states, maybe SB 1047, if you remember, probably it's going to come back. Almost every state is pushing it. It was also a government level, national level, with executive order. So the theory was, well, if you build very powerful open source, then the competitors will take advantage, you'll have it for free. But the alternative was, and I remember we discussed that even last year, that if you do not do it, then others will do it. Now, what is better from the United States perspective? Is it better to have everyone using an open source model developed in US? Or is it better to have everyone using an open source model developed by someone else? And by the way, people should understand, it's not about only DeepSeek, it's open source. Alibaba's models are open source. A few days back, it was this other model, Kimi, which is open source. So fundamentally, the open source create an artifact on which more people can use to build on, iterate, and improve it.
Right.
It's fundamental.
Yeah, I remember, in terms of the Biden AI executive order, you signed a letter along with some other open source researchers and venture capital firms saying that you thought the Biden AI executive order could restrict open source efforts. And with SB 1047, you were a very staunch opponent of the bill because of how it would impact open source. So now we're in this space where, you've been fighting these efforts that you say would restrict open source for the last year or two. And now a Chinese open model has, taken the lead. So do you feel emboldened? Do you feel like we need to do more as a country to prop up open source?
Absolutely. So look, I think that we got into this situation, right? And it's very important to understand what got us in this situation, right? Because if you don't understand it and you cannot change that structure of the ecosystem which got us in this situation, what you should expect is that the trends will continue. And if you look at the trends on the chatbot arena of the progress of DeepSeek versus the best models, if you just extrapolate to 6 months, it's not like these models is going to match, it's going to exceed significantly the best models developed in US. Nothing changes. You should expect the same trends. Now, there are voices actually on one, and I heard today, it's like, it's like actually they cheated somehow. They used maybe OpenAI data. They use the models from Llama, so it's bad for Meta. They release these models, which is absolutely false. It's like Llama so far is not a MOE model, a mixture of experts. It's not. It's a different architecture. So with OpenAI, if you do the math about they train on 14 trillion tokens, how much it will take? It will be tens of millions of dollars to just use OpenAI. But even if you can use it, how you are going to use it to get all the diversity you need in the training data set? How would you do that without OpenAI noticing? It's just crazy. Maybe they use some of the data like everyone is using. But I hear this and say, okay, we should clamp down on the open source models. Even more, we should the restriction of the exports, right? Export control and things like that. I think that it's a losing proposition. I think that it's just trying to slow down someone you don't have control instead of trying to accelerate, here where you have more control. For me, I think that the natural, again, I am biased, right? I will recognize that. For me, the natural way forward is to double down on open source, but even more to open source the entire recipe, the entire pipeline of training. Because right now, when we are talking about open source, in the case of large language models, we are only talking about open source weights. You have the model weights, the numbers, but you don't have the data on which you're trained. You don't have the algorithm, the code. You don't have the evaluation they used while training. So I think you need to open source all of those. It will be great. Ideally, open source data, open source code, open source weights, obviously, and open source evaluation. Because you want to maximize the talent which is going to work on solving this problem, because only then you can accelerate the innovation. And by the way, if you have the open source, open data, open code, and open evaluation, you can build so much more safer models.
Yeah.
What's next in innovation? That's not the right question. It's where. Puerto Rico, more than just a tropical paradise, it's innovation's paradise, where startups and global players coexist in a vast and vibrant ecosystem, where talent runs deep, highly skilled and bilingual. Plus, the island offers the most competitive tax incentives in the U.S. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. Find out more at investpr.org/equity.
I'm curious what you make of Microsoft. They just announced that they're going to host DeepSeek's models on Azure. And I'm curious what you make of that development.
People are voting with their money, right? It's a lot of demand. And now one of the concerns, I think it's from Microsoft, makes perfect business sense. Because what is the worry now? The worry is that these models are hosted in China. So the traffic is going to China, can be recorded and things like that. So Microsoft, I didn't know about this, but it seems a great move, right? It's like now you have in Azure and all the data is not going at least to China, so to speak. I think the other thing I wanted to say is that makes no mistake. I mean, when you say, oh, these guys, they cheated and things like that, in some sense, it's a little bit of arrogance, right? Which is not good. China has first class AI experts, and in the sheer number for sure, more than we have in US. We should have, all the respect in the world for what they achieved, right? Because only then we can do better, right?
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, I'm a little surprised to hear you kind of defend them, because I feel like we're in a moment right now where there's a lot of people who are saying, there's chip analysts who are saying, no, they have hundreds of millions of dollars of GPUs. They didn't use this small amount. And then there's, OpenAI just recently said, we have evidence that they, used our models, they distilled from us. So, I mean, what's your response?
Look, what I'm trying to say, I think that, like I said, they may have used some data distilled from OpenAI. It's very hard to believe that they used huge amount of data. So that's one. But then, I am focusing on what you can verify. Everyone can verify their performance. But they have also, if you think about reasoning, they have DeepSeek R1.0, right? Which shows that reinforcement learning is quite successful, at least for reasoning tasks where you have verifiers, whether the output is correct or not. So the performance is beyond doubt. But the other thing is like the cost of serving, the efficiency of the model. Where is they copied? They are the only things which are in public, right? Because certainly OpenAI presumably doesn't have as efficient models, because probably the cost will be lower. And the third thing, it's open source. We should embrace it because it's good for the community. These companies, they can actually benefit from these techniques they employed. It's a factor of what? 10 to 20, they are cheaper than 4.0, right? I think last time when I looked. So these are facts, not hypotheses about how such. Now, about the chip control, the export controls, there are cases in which they are effective, you should do it. There are cases in which maybe they are more counterproductive, like I'll give you examples, which are the encryption algorithms a long time ago. So each case, it's different. But in this particular case, I don't know. It's like the fact that there are exports control, you can clamp down on that. But let's not forget that scarcity and constraints also fuel innovation. For me, these are things which I cannot control. And things, some people believe they can control. I think it's very hard to control. Now it's like China has a very large footprint in the world. The point is, the main question, it has to be how you are going to have accelerated innovation in the US. That's the main question. Because it's very hard to stop them, okay? And how much energy you are going to spend in slowing down and stopping them, and how much energy and efforts you are going to spend in increasing the velocity of innovation in the US. That's the question. I prefer to think about, hey, if I cannot stop or even slow down significantly, how I make sure that I have a chance still to win. And the only chance you can win in this, under this assumption, is to move faster, to make faster progress.
Mm-hmm. And Jan, what kind of talks are you having with, policymakers, maybe people in the Trump administration, if any, about efforts to compete with China on AI and invigorate America's open source development?
Yeah, look, I'm telling everyone I'm meeting, and again, I am a researcher at heart. I'm not a Washington kind of guy or something like that. I'm telling the same thing. I think that when I look at the situation, I think the only way I see to compete is this: go one step forward than they went in open source. Open source the entire pipeline and get everyone to work on it. We need to find some funding from the universities to run these models and to train new architecture, new models, like new models, right? It's like open source end to end, and funding for universities, because, there is not a lot of money to start with, to do some serious work, and maybe tens of millions to pre-train new models, even if you are, very efficient. That's what that's why I say to everyone, what I'm telling you, what I'm saying here. If you look at my testimony last year and SB 1047, always was the first point about the open source. And my point was that if we slow down and if we add friction to the development, discourage the development of the open source, the logical conclusion is that within 1 year, we would use, at least in academia, open source models developed in China or elsewhere. It's a logical conclusion. You know, in the academia, you are going to use open source because you need to do some research, right? The only thing is that happens earlier than I thought. So I'm always asking everyone, like, what is the other solution? I'm just curious because it's like people, if you say that, they're cheating or I'm going to control them and so forth. Actually, the cheating argument is a little bit of denial, right? Because even if something like that happened, there are, like we discussed, clear evidence they make significant advancements when it comes to model efficiency, stability, and also in using RL successfully for reasoning. And the other thing is good. It's good for the community. It's good for everyone. They publish. It's open source.
Yeah. And just to kind of, wrap up here, I'm curious to get your thoughts on just a couple months ago, we were talking about how AI progress had hit a wall. And I want you to kind of remove the fact that DeepSeek is from China, remove the fact that it's open source. I mean, just the sheer technological breakthroughs that they came through. What does that tell you about, the pace of scaling laws and just AI progress generally today?
I think that obviously there is some truth to the fact that hitting the wall in terms of large language models and pre-training, right? In particular, that data being limitations, in particular, factual data, right? Factual data, you cannot generate synthetic factual data, right? That's oxymoronic, I think. But then it was quite obvious, and what happens is that, and it was very much expected, that there will be a lot of progress for some of the tasks where it's easy to verify the outcome. Because if you can verify the outcome, then I can make faster progress because these are generative models. That's how generative AI, that was kind of the name. They are very good at generating solutions. If I can verify the solutions, eventually I can select the good solutions. So I think that the reason we see this progress in reasoning, because in reasoning, you have this kind of task. If you are talking about math problems, so you talk about coding, you do have much easier to verify them. The problem, did you get the solution or not? With the coding, you have unit tests or things like that, right? So whenever you can verify it, you can make much, much faster progress. Like in life, you have a clear goal, right? You can verify. You are going to make much progress. You have an exam. You need to pass the exam, with a certain score, right? You are going to have a very clear target. You are going to learn for that, right? And you are going to make rapid progress. And I expect that this will happen more and more. And I think that will be a lot of efforts for adding trustful or learning trustful verifiers, they are calling reward models, for more and more kind of tasks. So I think this will drive the research and the progress quite a bit. So I expect a lot of progress for the task for which you can verify the outcome. I expect a lot of work on learning or creating high quality verifiers for more and more categories of tasks. I expect that RL will play an increasingly important role. Of course, it's not everything, it's great about RL. It's also very sample inefficient and so forth. Right? By the way, people are worried about, this is how we are going to use all these chips. If you do RL, you can use the chips a lot because it's very sample inefficient. You need to generate a lot of trajectories. You never, a lot of chain of thoughts, right? It's almost unbounded. That's what I would expect.
Yeah, they'll find a use for those chips somehow. So we're just about out of time. But thank you so much, Jan, for your time. We really appreciate it and hope to have you on again soon.
Thank you, Max.
Equity is produced by Theresa Loconsolo with editing by Kell. We'd also like to thank TechCrunch's audience development team. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.